By almost every historical metric, modern humans possess immense freedom. We have access to global mobility, limitless information, and wide-ranging career choices. We operate with liberties that previous generations could not even imagine. Yet, survey data and clinical reports reflect a distinct reality. Millions of people report of persistent unease, burnout, the exhaustion of the rat race, and a sensation of limits closing in despite the seemingly open doors. Look at this pattern. Initially, it registers as simple background texture, but these are bars. This is how the invisible prison operates. Subtle, restrictive structures that we mistake for the ordinary texture of daily life. This is an emergent structure. It is the accumulated residue of conditioning, comparison, economics, technology, and inherited narrative. Forces that were each individually reasonable, but together produce a state of refinement. To understand how this structure dictates behavior, we have to map these hidden boundaries. We will examine how they physically alter the biology of the brain and outline the specific practices required to reclaim actual agency. The resilience of this structure relies entirely on its invisibility. An inmate who believes they are already free will never attempt to leave. The architecture begins with the conditioned mind. Long before we can to it, childhood socialization installs an operating system. The brain acts as an evolutionary prediction machine, absorbing rules about safety and status, so it doesn't have to derive them from scratch. This hardware also indiscriminately installs unexamined material. A parent's anxiety about money or a culture's rigid definition of success becomes a permanent invisible filter. This conditioning determines which questions a person thinks to ask. Social comparison adds a second layer of constraint. In the 1950s, psychologist Leon Festinger formalized social comparison theory, demonstrating that without objective metrics, humans evaluate their lives by measuring themselves against peers. Our neurobiology evolved to track status within a tribe of roughly 150 people. Today, that exact same hardware is forced to process an effectively infinite digital environment, flooded with the curated highlight reels of millions of competing strangers. This chart illustrates hydronic adaptation. Following a major achievement, satisfaction spikes but rapidly decays back to the baseline. Meanwhile, the target goal moves perpetually upward, locking the individual into a treadmill of relative deprivation where enough is impossible to achieve. Beyond psychology, material reality imposes its own boundaries. Most adults must trade their time for the resources required to survive, an obligation that dictates the available energy and attention of nearly everyone. Modern consumer debt, like mortgages and student loans, functions as a uniquely effective barrier. Debt converts future time into a currently owed obligation, pre-committing years of labor before it even happens, and removing the material capacity for life changes. Technological design introduces a more deliberate form of control. While conditioning emerges from culture, this boundary is engineered. It traces directly back to behavioral psychologists like B.F. Skinner, seeing here testing operant conditioning in his laboratory. Skinner's experiments proved the power of variable ratio reinforcement schedules. He demonstrated that rewards delivered at unpredictable intervals produce far more persistent and compulsive behavior than rewards given on a reliable fixed schedule. Modern digital platforms weaponize this exact mechanism. The pull to refresh gesture and algorithmic feeds are variable ratio reward. Yule designed to exploit our hunger for social validation. Technology companies apply optimization power that easily overwhelms individual willpower. The structure is finalized by the stories we inherit. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard described living according to the crowd as an inauthentic existence, a state where a person never becomes a distinct self because they only execute what is expected of them. Society hands us a standard script: education, job, marriage, house. People execute this sequence like a computer subroutine. When they reach these milestones and feel empty, it is because those goals were absorbed by default rather than chosen through deliberation. Individually, wanting financial security or social connection is entirely rational. But when viewed as an interlocking system, these five forces brace one another. Their compounding architecture converts independent human choices into an automated predetermined path. If these forces dictate the majority of our waking hours, we have to ask why highly educated, capable people so rarely notice the structure containing them. The primary mechanism is normalization through ubiquity. Human perception relies entirely on contrast, because nearly everyone around us is operating inside the exact same economic pressures and technological environments. There is no contrast. A universal prison just looks like reality. The philosopher Michel Foucault analyzed how modern power structures maintain order through internalized regulation. Rather than punishing escape attempts with physical force, the modern system enforces compliance through direct rewards. Conforming to the expected script yields social approval, career advancement, and material security. This comfort leads to identity fusion. The person's sense of self-worth becomes entirely tied to the labels provided by the system, like being the reliable employee or the responsible one. Once identity and conditioning fuse, any attempt to question the underlying system triggers intense defensiveness. The individual interprets a gentle inquiry into their habits as a hostile attack on their very sense of self. When low-grade existential dread does manage to surface, the prison supplies immediate analysis. Productive distractions, whether it is throwing oneself into endless work or digital screens, suppress the discomfort before it can catalyze actual behavioral change. The modern cage is remarkably resilient because it successfully outsources its own security. It turns the inmates into participants who police their own behaviors and defend the exact constraints that limit them. This pressure leaves a measurable footprint in the human endocrine system and the physical architecture of the brain. Look at this model of the brain's stress response. The pressure of financial insecurity and digital comparison triggers the amygdala, keeping cortisol elevated. This lowly action never switches off, creating a physiological paradox. Sustained cortisol exposure structurally degrades the prefrontal cortex, while stress centers remain hyperactive. The prefrontal cortex is the exact region responsible for long-range planning, impulse control, and reflective thought. These are precisely the tools a person needs to step back, recognize their confinement, and plan a different course. Simultaneously, the dopaminergic reward system is hijacked by technological design. The brain is locked into a persistent loop of seeking stimulation without ever arriving at actual satisfaction. Generic positive thinking merely paints over the structural issues. Consumption-based solutions like expensive wellness retreats shift the comparison pool without dissolving it. Even total isolation fails if you carry your internal programming into the woods. The first requirement for genuine freedom is noticing automatic thoughts without immediately defending them. You have to create a gap between the observing mind and the stimulus. A gap where a conscious choice becomes possible. Next, you must accurately diagnose your constraints. You have to separate structural limits, like concrete economic obligations and physical health, from psychological fictions, such as inherited scripts and the fear of pure judgment. You must also introduce deliberate friction into your digital environment. Removing engagement-optimized technologies allows the mind to experience boredom. Left without external stimulation, the brain is forced to process information which is historically required for original thought. Thinkers across history have attempted to solve this exact problem of human automaticity. Plato described it in his Allegory of the Cave. The Stoics addressed it through the dichotomy of control, and Buddhist psychology termed it structural ignorance. The mechanisms of the prison evolved, shifting from ancient chains to algorithmic feeds. But the specific work of waking up from default programming remains continuous. Freedom is not a utopian endpoint devoid of all constraints or obligations. It is the ongoing clear-eyed practice of examining reality, separating automatic reflexes from your own values, and ensuring that the life you execute is genuinely the one you chose.